Hello and welcome to the stream. So to get started here today, our topic is going to be about doing technical interviews. Just a little bit about me first. My name is Nick. I've only been doing the streaming thing twice. I do a lot better with these sorts of things in a very conversational sense. So please send me messages, ask me questions. I will answer them as I get to them. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and get rid of that. Let's get started talking about interviews. So first off, I am super passionate about doing interviews. This is really rooted in like I want to help people get as far as they can when it comes to being a developer, and a big step to that is actually getting a job being a developer. So to help people with that, I have written a number of blog posts and I do a lot of technical interviews for boot camps and whatnot. Recently, I started doing technical interviews for a company called Carrot. And all of this is in addition to the technical interviews that I do at Stack Overflow as well. Um, so let's talk a little bit about like what we're looking for when we do an interview. I want to sort of focus this whole discussion here around like how to perform best as the candidate. And that's sort of my approach to interviewing in general is as the interviewer to give the candidate the best opportunity, and as like a person outside of the interviews to sort of tell you what we're looking for so you're least surprised when things come up. Um, about I don't know, 15 or so minutes from now, we're going to invite a friend of mine that I used to, or that I was in a study group with at Georgia Tech last semester, who is going to do a full technical interview with me. It's going to last about an hour. We'll go through the whole thing. It'll feel just like a real interview, and then at the end, we'll discuss it. During the interview, we'll talk about, or I'll answer questions while he's working through the problems. Okay, so first off, when we're doing technical interviews, let's talk about what we're looking for. And this comes down to some pretty much across the board stuff. Doesn't matter what company you're going to, and then we'll discuss some other things. The first thing is whether or not you actually understand the question. This is super critical. Like if you can't read a question or get some requirements and like formulate an approach, already you're going to have a tough time as a developer. So this is the first thing that we're looking at. How long did it take you to come up with this? Something that worked, not necessarily something that's like optimal or something that's like at the end. We're talking about getting things done as quickly as possible. This is going to be a recurring theme when it comes to interviews. You want to spend as much time focusing on getting as far as you can and solving as many problems and not so much on like making sure that all of this code is ready to go to production. So when you sit down to look at a problem, take in the requirements, try to break it down as quickly as you can into small pieces, and then start solving the pieces one by one and sort of talk your way through it, so that you tell your interviewer the approach that you're taking. A good interviewer will prompt you to do this, but even if they don't, you should remember to do it anyway. This lets them know like what you're trying to do, because you'd be really surprised as the interviewer how many times people tell you what they're going to do and then start doing something else. I have to turn the light on here. Um, and and that's the easiest time for an interviewer to step in and like help fix things, right? Like that's the job of the interviewer, is to assess your skills, but also to give you the best chance to succeed. And the way that we do that is by making sure that you're doing what you said you were going to do and that what you said you were going to do has a chance to work. Secondly, is very related to this, is we were looking for your thought process. Are you able to break it down into small problems? Do you solve these problems iteratively? Are you trying to solve the front to back? Are you trying to solve backwards to forwards? There's not to say that any of these things are better than the other. It's just to see that you have some sort of methodical process about it. And once we get that, you've pretty much checked off the box there. The next thing that we look at is speed. And this again is pretty much across the board. Now, speed is a really interesting thing, and I want to spend a little time talking about it. Speed has to do with not the speed at which you type, it has to do with the speed at which you're solving the problem. and making progress. So even if you don't get to the end of a question during the interview, the progress that you're making along the way is still going to count for some kind of value. Like we do want to see at the end that yes, you have succeeded and yes, you have like gotten to some sort of thing that will probably work, but we also want to make sure that you're able to go backwards and forwards and make whatever adjustments you need along the way, and doing this at a reasonable pace, um, so that we can get through as much as possible. I do want to mention one other thing about speed. As an interviewer, it is super critical that you limit the people on the amount of time that they have in order to solve a problem, or at least the amount of time that you are judging them on. If you give one candidate 40 minutes to solve a problem and another candidate 45 minutes, these two people are not like comparable on the same level. So keeping an eye on the time is super critical, and you'll see when I'm doing my interview that I actually have a timer running the entire time. And we're going to use this as a way for me to like mark down things that I can tell how fast you're going, and also to tell how much you got through in the amount of time that should count. Now, on that note, it sucks as the interviewee to be the person who's like working through the problem and like you're really making progress, or at least you feel like you're making progress, and then somebody pops in and tells you, "Oh, you're out of time and we have to stop now." So I won't always do that, especially if I feel like it's going to upset you or like change the way that you feel for the rest of it. Then I'm gonna cut it off, and or excuse me, I'm not going to cut it off. I'm going to allow you to keep working through the problem. I might step up the amount of like help that I'm giving you through that process, and just to make sure that you feel that some level of success by the time you get to the end of the question or to the end of the interview. All right, the next thing that we're looking for is quality. So the quality is like the most not or the most subjective thing that basically anyone is looking for. Some people call it quality, some people call it code style. A lot of different names for it, but basically looking at like, is your code readable? Is it maintainable? Is it expressive? Did you use, one character variable names, stuff like that. These sorts of things are not particularly good, or excessive vertical white space or inconsistent brackets, things like this that make it sort of hard to go through, kind of count as a negative. Now, the quality is generally one of those things where it's like, okay, there's tools that help you with this depending on the language, and we're writing in, either a Word doc or like a coder pad. So like you don't have your normal tools there, so there is a lot of leeway on this. But if there's like some just completely egregious mistake, or you're doing extremely novice things like saying some Boolean value and comparing it to true instead of just, if Boolean value, these sorts of things sort of add up over time if you have a lot of them to knock the quality down. Again, if you're watching, please ask questions. As soon as you have questions, I'll start answering them. In the meantime, I will keep going. The next thing that we're looking for is testing. Testing is super, super important. What we mean by testing is either you run your code, if we're using CoderPad, with some example input and make sure that it works, or you walk through it by hand if we're doing pseudocode. In either case, excuse me. So in either case, we want to see you do it without being prompted. You need to sort of test on your own to make sure that your code fits whatever requirements you think it needs to. And I want to really stress here that when you test things, don't just test the example input if example input is given to you. Try to think of at least one edge case. Even if all you do is mention, okay, I'm trying to think of an edge case, come up with something, or don't come up with something, but say it out loud so that it's explicit that you were at least thinking about that. Um, if you can't come up with a good edge case, then it's okay. Don't worry about it. If you can, then test it out. focus on maybe three or four of the ones that you think are going to be the most important, and then sort of just move on and say, like, I'm pretty sure this captures most of what we're looking for, and then keep moving on. Again, speed is really, really critical for just about any interview. Um, when it comes to identifying edge cases, that's like a whole discussion on its own. So I'm gonna skip that for now, but if that's something that you're interested in, just let me know and we'll come back to it after we do all of this. And then the next thing is the explanation. So you need to be able to explain how your code works in ways that is simple for anyone to understand. Like even like a brand new developer, somebody who's completely novice needs to be able to understand the code that you wrote. If you write something that's super clever, that's great, but you need to explain it really, really easily, um, because that's going to be a large part of your job basically anywhere you go. All right, so that's most of what we're looking for now. There are a couple other things that you might be judged on depending on where you interview. Your communication skills is super important. Whether the explanation is part of that, but in addition to that, whether or not you make assumptions when you're talking uh, about what the other person knows or what they don't know, how clearly you're able to dig into the details of the work that you've done, things like that. Let's see. That is most of what I've got for the discussion. Um, let's talk about the different parts of the interview. So when an interview starts, it's is basically just an introduction. Make sure that the communication is set up, that you've got you can hear each other, that sort of thing. And then once you get done with that part, we pretty much go into a brief introduction about me, a brief introduction about you. I will introduce basically a timeline for the expectation of what's going to happen during the interview. And then after we get done with the setting the expectations, then we're going to go right into talking about the candidate. We're going to ask for an introduction, really something super high level, something along the lines of like, oh, I worked here, 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 and these were my three main responsibilities throughout my career. That sort of a thing, like super, super high level, not trying to get into it. It should only last about a minute. After we're done with that, we move into a project discussion. We don't do a project discussion for every interview, especially at like Stack Overflow. We won't do it for the first one. It'll just get straight to the code to make sure that you are capable of writing code. But at pretty much anywhere else or any of the other interviews, you're going to have to spend some time talking at the beginning, about 10 or 15 minutes. This the goal of this part of the interview is for us to assess your depth of knowledge. So when it comes to answering the technical question, we have very specific things that we're looking for, and it's not going to test whether or not you know this stuff at a super deep level. We're not going to be asking like insanely hard things that you would have to be an expert in a language for. But when we're talking about a project, we want to make sure that you can explain the incredibly deep knowledge that you have about whatever the things are that you've worked on. During that portion of the interview, you'll see me taking excessive notes, and then kind of digging in. And I'm also going to force you to talk out of order. So this is something that you should get used to. Start off with the big bang and say like, oh, this is the thing that we did, and get me really, really excited about it. And that should take like a minute. And this should really sort of explain the context. You want to say like, this was why we were doing this. This is the goals that we had. This is the team makeup, and this was the part that I was responsible for. And that should take you about a minute and a half or so. And then once you get done with that, you want to kind of wait for a prompt, really. And a good interviewer will then turn right around and say, like, okay, this is the thing that I want to hear more about. And at this point, it becomes a discussion. And this is a really good place for you to be because now you get to answer exactly what the person wants to hear about instead of just rambling and wondering whether or not they think this is interesting or not. So a good interviewer will force you to tell or will force you to tell them what is interesting about the project to them. Um, Me specifically, I'm going to dig really, really, really deep on one or maybe two things, depending on how obvious it is that you're talking about something that you may or may not have, um, insane amounts of knowledge on. After that, we sort of transition. That's going to last, 10 minutes or so. We're going to transition into the actual code part. For the code part, start off with a little introduction. Say like, okay, we're going to answer one question. If you get through that question, we'll ask you another question. If you get through that, we'll just keep asking questions that get successively more difficult as we go. Please explain yourself, like your approach, before we get started. And you'll see me do all of this when we're actually doing the interview here in about 10 minutes or so. Um, let's see. So as we go through the coding problem, don't expect help. And if you get help, you should pretty much shun it for the rest of the interview. So this is one of the big things that I'm working on for my next blog post around it is this concept of hand holding. And this one I was asked previously. I did what do you call it? I did the podcast for Stack Overflow. I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. And one of the questions that was asked to me is, would you ever do anything to show um, what it's like on the interviewer side and how to be a better interviewer? And so this is sort of the first thing that I'm focusing on for that, which is this idea of hand holding. During the coding interview, during the actual technical part of the interview, the amount of help that you give to the candidate has to be taken into account in your evaluation of them. And if you're not explicitly doing that, then you can very easily pass on people. It's so simple to say like, okay, I only, there's 10 little sub problems and I only helped them with two, and that's what I did. But the level at which you help them with two is sort of what's important. Did you just tell them that they were missing a semicolon and that got them through their little bug? Or did you have to tell them like they need to iterate by index instead of by element? Something like that. Like these are two different levels of like you had to help them with the logic or you just had to help them with the syntax. And then there's like the third level, which is you have to help them formulate this approach. And at the point that you're helping them formulate an approach, like things are things are pretty much downhill at that point anyway. Um, so sometimes it'll help you help them get through to just one, but as the interviewer, it should be your responsibility to make sure that you are not just jumping immediately to like the really heavy hand holding and kind of going through this progression of assistance to help out as little as you can, but again, to make sure that the candidate eventually has a good experience by the time they get to the end, that they feel like they've accomplished something. So expect that blog post sometime in the next, I don't know, month or so. Got a lot going on. All right, another sip of water here. Does anybody have any questions? All right. The last part of the interview is what we call the Ask Me Anything part. In the Ask Me Anything part of the interview, I like to say that you cannot lose the interview, but you can win it. I don't care if you don't ask me any questions. My goal during this portion of the interview is to sell my company to you. I don't even care if like I am not going to pass you. I just want to make it very explicit that this is a great place to work, and if you have the opportunity, you should come work here. And that's the goal for me as the interviewer during the Ask Me Anything part. Uh, what you should be doing as the candidate is asking whatever questions will help you make your decision to choose Stack Overflow or whatever company it is that you're applying for over any other company that you are also interviewing with. This is your place to compare like what you'd be working on. This is your place to compare what kind of tools you'd be using, what the team formulation is. Are you working with PMs? Are you working with designers? Is it just a bunch of developers back there, cowboy coding or whatever you're doing? Do you have a process? Is there testing involved? There's so many questions you can ask about. Find something that matters to you, or at least find something that like if these two companies were the same, maybe this one thing would make a difference. Just ask something to help yourself. And if you're on the third or fourth interview and you don't have any more questions, don't worry about it. If you're on the first interview and you felt like you did a bad job, maybe start asking some questions because this is where you can win it. The way that you're going to win it is by sort of filling all of the holes that you missed in the rest of the interview. So if like you had a logic problem, start talking about another time where you had to solve something that was logically intense. If you were just nervous, use this opportunity to talk about things that you know at a very deep level that you should not be nervous about anymore. If you, what else could you fail at? If you were slow, yeah, well, actually, if you were slow, you're just kind of slow. It's not really going to help you, but you might as well have a good conversation to make yourself feel better at the end. Um, let's see. All right, so it's about 1:20. We're going to go ahead and invite in the candidate for today. Okay, great. Give me just a second while I try to invite them. Copy, invite, copy. They are looking right now as ready as I can be. Hello, can you hear me? Hey, great, what's up, man? It's been a long time. I'm great, man. So I'm at work and I just started doing the streaming thing. There's about 9 people watching us right now. Although I may be one of them, so maybe there's only 8. Um, in any case, this is being recorded so that we can share it with people later on. But everybody say hello to Pablo. Pablo is somebody that I was in an AI class with last semester at Georgia Tech in the OMSCS program. Um, had a great time and welcome to the show, man. How are you doing today? I'm doing good, man. So, first off, are you looking for a job out of curiosity? Sort of looks like you're at an office. Okay, great. All right, so that should make this a little bit easier. Out of curiosity, do you read my blog at all? Great. That's perfect because I posted the question on my blog that I'm going to ask you. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't going to see it already. Okay, so you have not seen the question that we're going to ask or anything like that, right? Okay, great. So I guess we're gonna go ahead and get started. Do you have any concerns or anything before we get started? Okay, great. So I'm gonna start off by giving you a link here to a CoderPad that you can join with me. And then in this CoderPad, don't worry about what it's like. Don't play around with it. We'll get to that in just a moment. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go basically into character. We're going to pretend as if you were interviewing at Stack Exchange. And I'm going to ask you a question that I have previously asked in real interviews here. So this is going to be basically a real interview. I will do it just like I'm running a real interview. All right. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. All right. Hello, can you hear me? Oh, great. Okay, my name is Nick. I've been at Stack Overflow now for about, God, call it 9 years? No, 7 years. Yes, okay, 7 years. All right, I got it. So for the first 4 years, I worked on the careers team as a developer. I built out a lot of prototypes for a lot of the features there. Other people are better than me at implementing production stuff, so a lot of people did a lot of the production work for the stuff that I worked on. I did do some production stuff, but a little bit less than everyone else. About 3 years ago, I switched over to the data team here at Stack Exchange, and I am now a data engineer. I am not a data scientist, but a data engineer. All right. So a little bit about this interview. It's going to last somewhere between like 45 and 60 minutes. We're going to start off talking about your background and then a project that you've worked on. I'll describe to you exactly what we're looking for when we get there, and then after that, we're going to switch over to a coding exercise, which is going to last about 30 or 40 minutes. Um, After that, there will be an Ask Me Anything period. You can ask me anything about what it's like to work at Stack Exchange. Do you have any other questions before we get started? Okay, great. So let's hear a quick, brief introduction about yourself, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Focus really just on the high level stuff, sort of like I did. Tell us a little bit about your background and focus on the technical stuff. That's awesome. Oh, Pablo, I'm sorry. We have to pause here for a moment. People are saying that they cannot hear you. Oh,
I
here, let's
wonder.
change. All right, let's change. All right, go ahead and start talking again.
Okay, so from the top.
Yeah, no, just go ahead and start where you were.
Okay, where I was. Okay, yes, that basically the educational aspect of being able to teach things help me keep my skills in good shape, and also helps me try to get more people to like computer science, which is a huge objective of mine. In terms of my real job, what I do most of the time, I've been a software engineer. Now I'm a senior software engineer at Red Pixel Studios. It's a company in Owensboro, Kentucky. I've done so for almost 12 years now. I started as a web backend engineer, so basically doing backend for web-based systems. And then as about 10 years ago, whenever the iPhone came up, we saw an opportunity to get into mobile development. And since then, I've specialized on mobile development, particularly on the iOS side, though I do mingle a little bit onto the Android side.
Okay.
That also, we explored applications for Mac OS as well, since the both environments have kind of like drifted towards one another. So that's what I've been specializing on.
Okay, that's awesome, man. So, can we go ahead and switch over now? Let's talk about a specific project that you've worked on recently. I don't know, sometime in the last year, maybe 2 years, something that you had a large technical impact on, and something that was particularly challenging for you, or that you were, particularly proud of. When you start talking about it, spend maybe, I don't know, a minute or two, and just tell me a little bit about the context. So, start off and tell me about, why you were doing this, what you were doing. Tell me who was on the team, and then tell me what your responsibility was.
Sounds good. Basically, the probably in the last few years, one of the projects that I've been involved for the longest, or that has captivated most of my time, that I can talk about. There's a couple of projects that obviously are under NDA and they're still under development. But it's a project that it's published, and that's a company. We partnered with a company in Lexington, Kentucky called MedMovie, and worked for the American College of Cardiology into building a companion piece for doctors to explain cardiological issues to patients. It's basically a patient education tool. It had a lot of requirements in terms of needing to run on older operating systems, needing to run on Android and iOS, and in all of those with equivalent performance. It had the idea of both doing three-dimensional models of the heart with specific cross sections, and at the same time have educational videos and interactive components such as being able to draw on a heart and explain what the procedure, for example, the stenting procedure for a patient would be, and let the patient, him or herself, through interaction with a tablet, be able to kind of like put a stent on their own heart and things like that, just to get them familiarized with what the procedure was going to be, which is proven to have patients be more comfortable with what's going to happen. Of course, somebody's going to be messing with their heart. So it was a very, very interesting project. It involved a team of people here in Owensboro. We worked with a sister company in Argentina, people obviously in Lexington, and people in the American College of Cardiology, which are spread around the U.S. So
Wow, that's awesome.
it was a lot of components put together. So it was very interesting. We had to work heavily not only on the development part. My role on that was basically the lead engineer, the lead project engineer, but also in keeping up a good set of documentation artifacts to be able to facilitate that communication. So keeping good SRSs with the final client, which was the American College of Cardiology, and then a lot of formal documentation in between the teams developing the solution.
Okay, that's awesome. So there is so much going on there. Can you can you tell me the part that you thought was like the most difficult or the most challenging, not from like a personal side, but like a technical side?
The most challenging part probably was the dealing with the three-dimensional aspect of it. We were tasked for it to having to run on all the way from an iPad 2 to the newest iPads, and we started hitting a lot of memory resource exhaustion, basically, in many cases. So we had to do some juggling to be able to make it to where you didn't have to spend a lot of time either loading a particular model, or it was not a choppy thing whenever you were rotating the heart around, but still was able to run smoothly and nicely as it does the newest iPad Pro on an iPad 2, which is a device that, in terms of technology, it's an ancient device.
So tell me the differences between the old one and the new one that made this so challenging.
First, you have the concept of the old one cannot run the newest operating systems. So you have to start doing things like duplicating work in certain portions of the app to accommodate older OSs. And then it was the fact that an old iPad 2 has much less RAM than a newer iPad or a newer Android tablet, for that matter. This was a cross-platform solution. And we were programming things natively. So it was not something like Xamarin or a tool where you coded once and deployed in multiple platforms. These were native iOS and native Android apps. So that was the main roadblock that we hit, the memory, just not having enough random access memory.
Okay, that's awesome, man. Can you tell me, okay, we're gonna come back to this in just a second, but can you tell me like a specific thing that you had to duplicate to make it work for the older OS that you would not have had to have done for the newer one?
Um, Let me see. I'm trying to think about it. If it is okay, I may give it a couple of minutes in the back of my head, and I'll come back to that later.
That's fine. Okay, can you tell me about how you overcame the problem of not having as much RAM to keep the interface smooth?
It involved a lot of multi-threading.
Multi-threading.
That was the main topic that we had to exploit. We had to come back to the point where MedMovie was the company that was providing the source files, where we had to tell them we need lower resolution files and be able to leverage different resolutions for different devices. It was one of those things where even though it might not be to the untrained eye, it might not be perceptible, the differences, but they were there. We know that they're there. If we search for them, we can see them. But it got to the point where definitely we could not run the highest resolution source material, source files that they wanted for the older devices. And in the end, I think that the difference was so minimal that they were okay with it, and everybody thought that the final result was more than acceptable.
Okay, so Is there like a display difference between these devices or something like that? Like you said that the difference was minimal. How are you estimating that?
The difference is in between it's the resolution of the textures. So basically, you would see a little bit of a pixelation on older devices,
Okay, I got it.
even though the older devices actually have less resolution than an iPad Pro, for example.
So I'm curious, just did y'all do any user testing with this?
The user testing and quality control was up to a subcontractor of the American College of Cardiology. So we would send them test flights and beta versions for Android, and they would run their own quality control, or they would run the quality control on their end. We would do more than anything, just unit testing and code quality control on our side.
Okay, wow, that is so super interesting. So, out of curiosity, let's come back. You've had it in the back of your brain for a moment. Can you think of anything about the differences between the OSs that you had to duplicate?
There were a couple of things on how to load sequences of images, for example, for certain parts of the animation, that it's done differently on older OSs and it's done more efficiently in newer OSs. So I remember having to basically do some precompiler instructions that basically split the code. So you say, if this is available, or in the case of Android, if we're working with Honeycomb or older, just do this method of loading images, otherwise do that. So that's the part where it was just big if statements with precompiler conditions that would either go through a path of the code or another, which of course it's code duplication. It's not terribly elegant, but it was needed.
Okay, that's great, man. Okay, that is a really good description of the project. So we're actually going to go ahead and move on to, I mean, I could pick your brain about that all day. It sounds like a really amazing project. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to go ahead and move on to the code portion of the interview now. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
paste a link in here to a coder pad. I can see
Okay.
that you're already in there, but we're going to go ahead and imagine that you're not. Here is a link to the
Okay.
coder pad. If you could go ahead and please join. I think you're going to have to sign your name in when you join.
Okay. And do I have to put my real name?
You can put whatever, it doesn't matter.
Okay. I'll go ahead and do it. Okay. I should be in.
Okay, great. So you can see in here that this is currently in plain text mode. If you see the little drop down, there's a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of different languages. I prefer that you implement everything in pseudocode for this, but if you're more comfortable
Okay.
writing in a language, then by all means write in a language.
Okay.
Okay, great. So I'm going to describe to you the problem. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask you a single question. Um, when you come up with a way to solve it, like an approach, just tell me what the approach is before you get started. I want you to write everything as a function. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
specify the inputs and I'm going to specify the outputs. Just write it as a function that takes those inputs and returns that outputs. Any testing that you want to do, make sure that you do it outside of the function.
Okay.
Okay, so the first function is going to be called um, point in rect. So I'm going to give you an example here where we have a box. This is all pseudocode. And
Mm-hmm.
a box is made up of a point called min and a point called max. All right.
Okay.
A point is another object that has an x, which is some sort of floating point, and a y, which is also some sort of floating point. All right. So the
Mm-hmm.
function is called point in rect, takes in a box, takes in a point, and then returns true if the point is in the rect or false otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. And then as soon as you're ready, go ahead and get started.
Just a quick question. Am I to assume that Box has some controls to make sure that min is both x and y are less than max?
That's absolutely right.
Okay, so the box has that control in it already.
Correct.
Okay, fantastic. That was my main question.
Okay.
Let me think for a second. Um, Probably the main approach that I would take is just to make sure that x is in between box min x and box max x, and that y is in between box min y and box max y.
Okay, that sounds good.
And do you want me to go ahead and pseudocode it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm almost jumping into, let's make it a little bit more language agnostic. Something like that.
Okay, do you want to do any testing?
Um, sure, if it is possible.
Yeah, I mean, just walk through it. Drop an example.
Oh, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Just make up some input.
Oh, make up some input.
Yeah.
So basically, the idea would be you'd get uh, and is it okay to assume that I can uh, create it like this? Use a
Yeah,
more
that's fine.
constructor like this?
Yeah, however you want to is fine. This is all pseudocode. Just explain to me how you expect it to work.
Okay. So basically, the idea would be to create a point, and you would assign both x and y to it, and that would become the minimum point for your box. You would do the same thing for the maximum point for the box. And I'm being a little bit more overly verbose than I would probably be in a normal
That's
coding
fine.
environment. More than likely, all of this function would have been just a return with the Boolean expression in there. But
Okay.
so we'd create a box, and we would say that the box min is equal to the minimum point, and the box max is equal to the max point. And then we'll create a second point or a question point. And the question point would have an x of 5. Question point would have a y of 5. And we would use point in rect the box and passing the question point. And I would expect this to return true.
Okay, great. So can you think of any edge cases?
Of course, I mean, there could be some cases on this is 0 and 0. That would be the minimum where the question point is equal to the minimum point, and it should return true since our conditions here are less than or equal. Of course, this could be 10 and 10, and that would be the case on where the question point is equal to the max point, and it should still return true. That's considering that the question of point in rect is inclusive. And of course, at the minute you start going with anything above that, so 0.1, that would make it outside of the rectangle, or if you start getting into any negative numbers in this case. And of course, it all depends, these edge cases depend on the minimum and maximum point of the box.
Okay.
Since we have already established that box already controls that maximum is bigger than minimum, we don't have to worry too much in our point in rec function. Otherwise, we would have to validate that the box is a valid box.
Okay, great. So we're going to scroll back up to the top. I want to keep the point and the box definition near where we're going to be working. So the next question we're going to answer here is build bounding box.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and the way that this is going to work is you take in a list of points, or we're just going to call it, and then it should return a box, and that box should be the minimum bounding box required to capture all the points.
Okay.
Returns a new box that is the minimum size to capture all points.
Okay. So basically the approach that I would take for this would be to go through all the points and capture both the minimum x and the minimum y and the maximum x and the maximum y for these for all the points. And then the bounding box would have a min point equal to the minimum x and the minimum y, and a maximum point equal to the max x and max y.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and do that.
Okay. And we have to stray away from Python mapping and all that stuff, right?
You know, do whatever you want to do. Like I said, all you have to do is explain it to me. It's pseudocode.
Okay, so
yeah, focus on speed and getting through it as quickly as you can.
Okay, so we would set a minimum x to the some form of constant. Most programs do have a constant that it's something like the minimum float or the minimum or less infinite in the case of Python, for example.
Okay.
So that is what that min would be if that is acceptable.
Got it.
And in the same way, we would have a max x, and we would use that constant for the maximum. For example, in the case of Python, it would be plus infinite.
Okay.
And then we would go on for each one of the points. We would say if the point x is, actually this is opposite, sorry, max, min. If the point is less than the min x, then min x becomes that point dot x if the point y is less than the min y, then min y becomes the point y. If point x is greater than max x, then max x becomes the point x. And if point dot y is greater than max y, then max y becomes that point y. And then we would create a final box. And we'd assign the min to
You can just, come up with some terse syntax like, point whatever, and then just put in,
min and okay.
yeah, something like that.
So a constructor, just assume that it has a constructor.
Yep.
So min x equals, or sorry, x equals min x, y equals min y, and equivalent to max and return final box, something like that.
Okay, great. So can you think of any edge cases for this one as well?
The only thing that I can think of is if, for example, there's either no points passed, that would be a problem. We may need to just check for that. If there is only 1 point passed, then you have the not a real. It might violate the test for box of it being where maximum and minimum are different. In that case, maximum and minimum would be the same. And then just with the points that you have, you may get a case where you have multiple points, but they are either all the same or they have the same x or y component. And in such case, you would end up having a line more than a box.
Okay, that's great. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question now. So again, we're going to push this down. All right, this question is called change aspect ratio. And this takes in a box and a float. All right, and this returns a new box with the aspect ratio equal to the given float. All right, just a quick definition here. Aspect ratio equals width divided by height, so that we're definitely sure about that. So the idea here is you take in a box and the box has an aspect ratio. And what we're going to do is change the aspect ratio of that box under certain conditions. The box can only get larger, so you have to figure out whether it should grow wider or whether it should grow taller. And it should expand from the center of the box.
Okay.
Okay, so don't worry. Well, I guess if you have any questions, just let me know.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. I think that the first item in the list would probably be to do a quick exit check. Just check the aspect ratio of the current box. And if it is the same as the float that it's passed, then we can exit gracefully, return the same box. That might be a good way to avoid getting into further calculations.
Okay.
So in order to calculate the current aspect ratio, of course, we would have to divide the current width by the current height. We can calculate that. By having the maximum and of course, if current aspect ratio is equal to the float, then we can return the box. Now, probably now that we have the current width and the current height, if the current aspect ratio is less than, I might be speaking out loud here,
Yep.
rubber ducking. If the current aspect ratio is greater than the aspect ratio desired, then that probably means that the height is larger. So the current aspect ratio is less than the desired aspect ratio. We should have to we don't want to reduce the width any, because that would make more than likely our box smaller. I would love to test this with real numbers, but just for the sake of speed, I'm gonna go with it for now.
If you need to test with real numbers, you have plenty of time. You have about 20 minutes left.
Okay. How much longer do we have after this function?
20 minutes for the rest of the coding portion.
Okay. After this function, how much do we have in terms of coding?
I won't ask you any more questions to code after this. I will ask you questions to answer verbally.
Okay. So let me have a. I'm gonna go with pen and paper, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay.
All right.
So we're going to have if the current aspect ratio greater than our float or desired aspect ratio, then that means that we're going to have to grow vertically. So we're going to calculate the new height as the current width times let me just go back onto some of this. It's the inverse of the desired ratio. Otherwise, new width will be equal to the current height times the ratio. Trying to see. I have these, I think, inverted. And we could have done something like new height equals current height, and new width equals current width. Now we have to solve the problem of centering it up. And in order to center it up, we would have to get the difference in between the new width and the current width, and the new height and the current height. So width would be equal to, we know that they're going to be bigger than the old ones, so bigger or equal then. So new width minus current width, and we need to add it to each one of the ends. So divided by 2, height equals new height current height divided by 2. Now to our box, min x, we can say that it's box min x minus the different width, box max x equals to box max x plus difference width and height. Turn. Okay, I'm not completely confident on this, but I think it would be a good starting point to maybe set up a few unit tests and see how it does.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that.
set up the unit test?
Yep.
Okay.
Just prove to me that it works.
Well, I would, basically what I would do is set up some, like I mentioned, some unit testing. And in doing that, I would start creating some examples. So for example, I would go with something where I have a current box that it has a minimum of, and let's do the, we had said x0, 0, and a box that has a maximum of point and 10, and we would do a change. Of course, the ratio on that is 1. We would change aspect ratio of that box, for example, to 0.5. So basically the idea would be 1/2. So we would expect the width of it, 1 to height, we would expect the height of it to go to 20. So we would get the result of that. And depending on if you're using something like JUnit or whatnot, you would do some sort of assert that assert equal that that is equal to the box checkbox and equals 0.00. Max and 20. And we would check that checkbox and box are equal.
Okay.
And I would do this with something like this, and with a positive ratio as well, positive greater than 1 ratio, just to check that I have those measurements. Then I would probably do it with something, just trying to check my bearings in terms of having something that it's wider than it is taller, and it needs to become wider still. And something that's wider than it's taller and needs to become taller, and the other way around, something that it's taller than it is wider and it needs to become wider, something that's taller than it's wider and needs to become taller still.
Okay, great. So for the example that you have here, can you just walk through it and sort of show me that it does work for this example?
It's going into the function.
Yes.
Okay, so basically we have a box that is basically 10 by 10. We're trying to change it, which is a ratio of 1. We're trying to change it to a ratio of 1/2 of 1/2. So basically the idea is we get the current width and the current height. They should be 10 and 10. The current aspect ratio, we divide 10 divided by 10. That should be 1. The current ratio, it's not equal to the desired ratio, so we're going to return, we're not going to return the box. We're going to assign the new width and the new height to 10 and 10. We're going to check and see the current aspect ratio. If the current aspect ratio is greater than the float, in this case, the current aspect ratio that we had was 1. It is greater than the float, so we're going to calculate the new height as the current width, which was 10, times float, which was 0.5, and that will give us actually a new height of 5, which is not what we wanted. Probably what we want is I think what we had at the beginning, which was one overflowed to invert that and make it a 2. So 1 over 1/2 would become 2. So the current width would be 20, which is what we expected. So I think that this should have been like this. In the end. So that would make it the current height, the new height be 20. Now, after we do that, of course, the width has not been modified, so nothing will change over here. The difference width would be 0. So this whole part does not affect. Now, the difference in height would be 5. So we would reduce 5 from the point, from the start, and we would increase height on the y-axis on the maximum. So actually, again, my test needed a little bit of a check. We needed this and this. And that's how we would get to the exact same. So I think that it was a decent starting point. It needed some adjustments, both on the test side. I needed to pay a little bit more attention at basically the idea that didn't have in my mind when writing the test that it needed to be centered. So that was this little modification here. And then that I had inverted basically what I needed to multiply by to get new height and new width.
Okay,
Because of
man.
the aspect ratio being width over height versus height over width.
All right, man, that's perfect. So that answers all of the technical questions that we're going to have for this interview. For the
Okay.
rest of the time that we have here, you can ask me anything about what it's like to work at Stack Exchange. There's only 2 exceptions. Number one is you can't ask me anything to do with money. That means how much money you'd make if you worked here, how much money we have in the bank, what our burn rate is, etc. Those are all valid questions. They're just not questions I can answer. You need to ask your recruiter.
Okay.
And then the other thing is you cannot ask me how you did on this technical question because this interview is still not over.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right.
So my first question would be in terms of the size of the team and basically the general requirements that an applicant or an actual a person that gets hired would have in working with that team.
That's a great question. So I would say, in general, for developers, we have about 4 or maybe 5 main teams here. The QA team, the talent team, the internal dev team, the data team, and then another team for doing ads, who's sort of a multi-responsibility team. The culture for each of these teams is actually a bit different. The code bases are largely separate between each of these teams, and the way that they do testing and handle all that kind of stuff is also separate. The team that I work for is the data team. On the data team, we have a very small team. There's 3 engineers and 1 data scientist. Um, so super small. Things are kind of very separated. There's not a whole lot of working on the same things with other developers at the same time. Uh, our responsibility on this team is really to go out and work with other teams at the company to help them achieve their goals from a data perspective, either doing analysis or building models or whatever else. If you're on the talent team, it's a it's a much bigger team. They do some testing. The testing is very happy path testing, things like making sure that you can still buy things, that sort of stuff. But there's no like individual unit testing all the way down to everything. I don't think they do TDD, although I haven't been on the team in a while, so I'm not entirely sure. On the QA team, there is like what I would call minimal testing, which is if things are broken, they need to be fixed. Then they would do that kind, they would make sure that it's not going to break again, that sort of thing. I actually have no idea how the internal team organizes their tests, but I hope that answers that question. Requirements for being on the different teams. We pretty much only hire full stack devs at Stack Overflow. There is the exception of the mobile team. The mobile team is made up of a couple of people who know mobile inside and out. Oh, that is another dev team, the mobile team. Very, very small team. And then let's see. The QA team is also quite large. I'll be honest, I don't entirely know, like what they're working on other than the very high level stuff that you see in like the CEO report sort of a thing. But as for like the individual, what the code looks like, how to get in and deal with the nitty gritty of it, I can't really answer those questions. But maybe in your next interview, you'll have somebody from that team and they'll be able to answer your question better.
Fantastic. In terms of, I imagine code repository, and you mentioned full stack. Is there any particular versioning control system that is preferred?
Right now, we use Git across the board for all of the version control. We host GitHub internally. Like we have our own like enterprise GitHub setup. We were
Mhm.
previously on GitLab, and before that we were on Mercurial. So there may be a few remnants here and there of like things that look specific to it, but all of that stuff is gone today.
In terms of personal preferences, I do enjoy the possibility of being able to work remotely. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my favorite parts about working at Stack Overflow. When I first started, I worked for 2 years in the office, and I was one of the first people to go remote from the office. A few more people have done it since, and a couple of people have gone the other way as well, where they were remote and then moved to work in the office. It's been great. So like, I was very nervous the day that I went to ask if I could go remote. Um, my wife and I sort of decided that we wanted to start a family, and starting a family in New York just wasn't really a thing that we were going to do. We needed to be near our family, and I walked into my boss's office at the time. I told him that I was looking forward to, that we were gonna move just one way or another. And he was like, okay, let me ask a few questions. And about 45 minutes later, maybe an hour later, he called me back in. He's like, yeah, everything sounds good. And it's like, that's remote. So
Yeah, I'm about to start a family, so that's in a personal level. I know that we focus on the professional level, but I'm about to start a family, so that's very important to me
oh, that's
as
great.
well. So I can
Congratulations.
completely understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, so working remote is a good bit different than working in an office. Like in an office, people
Mhm.
look at you and they're like, "Hey, he's working because he's here," when really like what I'm doing is playing Diablo, So, but at the same time, like uh, the first like 3 weeks was extraordinarily hard. So if you don't have any experience with it, you might want to practice a little bit. For the first like 3 weeks, the laundry needed to be done, the dishes needed to be done. I was like, vacuum too, because it's just kind of really hard to focus when you're in like a different environment for like all of a sudden. Um, and so a couple of things, get really. Do you need to take that?
No,
Okay.
I don't believe it's for me.
All right. So you need to practice at being loud. Like this is the best advice I can give anybody who's being remote. Like you're not in the office. People aren't walking and seeing you in there. They're not seeing you at lunch. They're not seeing you in meetings. What you need to do is be active in chat, be active in email, constantly be telling people what you're working on, constantly be looking for feedback on whatever else you can get. And that's pretty much that's like the best advice that I can give you. So if this is going to be new to you, and then also like, you know, get a door. That's the other best advice. With a door, you can shut out the outside world. You have to set the expectation, at your household that like work time is work time.
I currently work. I've worked from Argentina a couple of months at a time remotely,
Okay.
which that added another different experience, which was also dealing with a much larger time difference because of the time zones. I've worked from Europe in the past, so it's definitely an interesting and, like you mentioned, a different kind of challenge. But um,
Yeah, so time zones are actually another interesting thing here. We are a fairly dispersed team. We have a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in the US spread out all over the US, not just on the East Coast. Um, I'm trying to think of people outside of Europe. We used to have just a lot of people in Eastern Europe, not just in Western Europe. So yeah, like we have people all over the place, and there will almost certainly be somebody in the office when you're in the office. Now, certain teams, my team is almost entirely East Coast, with the exception
mhm.
of our data scientist who is in not Mountain Time. Mountain Time? Yeah, Mountain Time. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Even still, like if you're in the same time zone, I work in the mornings. I come in at 7, I leave at 3, to let my wife go and do some work in the afternoon, and then I take
Hmm.
care of our kids. And like there's a lot of flexibility here. The only requirement is that you really have to be around for the meetings and you have to be available for your team to answer questions and make sure that like we're not waiting a day between like questions getting answered, that sort of a thing. But that's a really good question.
And my last question would be if there's any kind of conflicts of interest, or if there's any policy in terms of conflicts of interest with the fact that I would like to, for example, keep teaching. So how does your company handle the working for other companies as well?
That's a great question. So when I started, I actually owned a company, and my wife and I still own a company. And when we started, we just sort of told them what the company was. You have to set a boundary, like this sort of stuff belongs to the company, the stuff that you do for the company, this sort of stuff belongs outside. Working in open source, totally fine, totally allowed. The business that I run, I do interviews, like contractually through another company. Occasionally, I'll like help friends out with whatever, like building a WordPress site or something like that. And then my wife and I also have like a business where we like sell gifts and stationery. So
Hmm.
there's not really any issues with that. When it comes to like dividing up your time, there's basically you're going to set your expectations at work about what you're going to get done, and you really like need to get it done. So for the first 6 months or so, we expect you to get ramped up. It's going to take some time. And then after the first 6 months, you really should have a good grasp of about how much you can get done in a set amount of time. And set the expectation with the company when you have your weekly meeting with your team and let them know what you expect to get done and then try your hardest to make sure that that gets done. It's okay to say like, all right, this is like my main goal and then like here's my corollary goal. And if you don't get your corollary all the time, it's not that big of a deal. So just make sure that you're getting your main stuff done. But I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And those are my main questions regarding work environment. I'm sure that as time progresses and uh, the second and third interview, like you mentioned, I would have more specific questions.
Okay, great. So the way that this works now is I am going to package all of this up and I'm going to send it back over to our recruiter, who will then get back in touch with you and let you know what the next steps are.
Sounds fantastic.
All right. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to send me an email and I will be happy to answer them. I can't promise you that I'll answer them immediately, but I try to get to emails within about 24 hours.
I appreciate it. That's fantastic.
All right, great. And that right there is the end of the interview. So how do you feel?
I feel like I haven't done these in a long time.
Well, hey, you did actually really good, man. I'm super pumped about how fast you were able to get through that. How clean everything was. There were a couple of bugs in there, but nothing that you didn't solve on your own. There was no hand holding here whatsoever, other than to
Great.
tell you that you might want to test it one time.
Yeah.
And that's it. I had a couple of notes. Let's see. Yeah, I would say like the only issue at all with the whole interview was that at the beginning you gave a long spiel about yourself. When I asked you to speak for about 2 minutes, it really took about five for you to get through your through your background. But other than that, man, I think you knocked this out. I think you did a really good job with those questions too. If you had done even worse on this, like the questions were nice. They were very obviously things that you cared about, things that were going to help you make your decision about whether or not to work here. But yeah,
Absolutely. It was a great experience.
yeah, no, I really appreciate you doing this because I wanted to do this on the stream for a while. I've wanted to stream an interview for a while, and I think I might actually end up doing a couple more of these. Maybe not on stream, but recording some YouTube videos or something, just so that people can see and sort of get the impression and the feeling of what it's like in an actual interview. You know.
And I have to say, of course, it had the easiness and the niceness of being a mock interview, but also I had a little bit of a scene panic of knowing that there's maybe a few people that are going to be looking at this. So what happens in the internet stays in the internet forever.
Yeah.
so that was a little nerve-wracking.
That's fine. So, do you, I don't know if you need to go, you feel free to go. You don't have to hang out. But there's at least one question here
Mhm.
in the chat that says, what position level would this interview be for? Do you have an answer for that? And then I will give like my explanation.
I don't. I don't know. As you as the interviewer would have would have told me. I'm not sure what the level this would be, but it seems like it was like a first time interview, kind of like an initial interview, even without a specific team in sight, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we ask this question when we used to ask this question would be for like the very first code review type of interview. Normally, we wouldn't even have the introduction like about yourself getting into your project. By the way, your project actually did sound interesting. I was like totally into that. And that's the best
Well,
kind
thank
of
you.
discussion to have in an interview. Because I seriously could have just sat there and pegged your brain about it all day, but we had to keep moving. So at Stack Exchange specifically, we only really hire full stack developers. So like, there's kind of one level that we hire for, mid, junior, senior. Really, you kind of go through the same interview process. Uh, I don't like separating the idea of having, interviews for different levels unless you have a need for it. We don't really have a need for it because we're sort of expecting everybody to be full stack. We are willing to train people who are up and coming, like fresh college grads, whatever, like no problem, as long as you can show that you have the ability to like solve this problem and these problems at a reasonable pace and, with some methodical way of going about things. So to answer your question, we don't actually have a separation of like mid, junior, senior. I think if another company was doing this, they would probably have this be like the junior to mid level. At Stack Exchange, you will probably only have one other code question, and then after that, well, one other code question like this. And then after that, you would move on to interviews that are very specific to other things like can you design features? And can you work with product managers? Stuff like that, as opposed to like just sitting down and solving four different coding problems. Like we're going to test you on the full stackiness of your abilities. So I hope that answers your question in the chat there. If anybody else has any more questions, feel free to ask now, and we'll go ahead and answer them. I don't know if you can stick around. We got about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 more minutes.
I can probably stick around for another 5 minutes or so.
Okay, great. We'll see if anybody asks a question. Do you have anything about the interview you want to critique me?
Oh no, I thought that it was fantastic. I thought it was very professional, and of course we know each other from last semester somewhat, so that made it like I said much more relaxed. But yeah, it's interesting for my seniors for the seniors that I'm teaching at the local college. One of the things that they are going through is mock interviews, and they were one of the main questions that they had was, what does it mean we read full stack everywhere, and what does it mean? So we went through that a couple of classes ago. Um,
That's interesting. So I used to do interviews when I lived in Atlanta for a startup code school called uh, Digital Crafts. Oh wait, here's a question. I would have asked, what's the definition of full stack? That's funny. So DB backend front end. Basically, it means that you can get like a website up and running off the ground on your own. You don't necessarily need to be like at the level of, an SRE or like a DevOps type of person, but you need to be able to like, go and buy a host name. You need to get some hosting. You need to be able to make sure that you can communicate with a database in whatever your language of expertise is, or your language of choice at least. And then be able to understand all of the different parts about like, yeah, basically yes, spin something up. And then also make sure that like you can do the front end, you can do the JavaScript, you can do the HTML, the CSS. Not that you can design at all, just that like you can work through the problems of getting these things set up and making them look like you want them to look like. But yeah, getting the whole thing set up and doing it kind of on your own. Like if you were asked to start a new project and get it off the ground and get it running before we added other people to the project to start building features, that you'd be able to handle that. And that's sort of what full stack means.
As an example, I am a mobile full stack, an iOS full stack engineer, software developer.
So what are the main parts of like a mobile full stack as compared to like a web full stack?
The addition that I would say is, for example, in the case of iOS, of course, you have the database tends to be a core data database, which is kind of like a wrapper around SQL. So you do have a database. It's very much so an MVC type approach. So you have to create your views, which you storyboard them, your models, and your controllers. But I would add to that the fact that in most cases, that database backend, it's not only local in the app, but in most of the apps that we've developed, it has a web backend somewhere. There's a server somewhere, database server somewhere that it needs to communicate with. So in most cases, we're actually coding also an API, which what I've done, it's APIs on PHP. So it's a PHP RESTful API that communicates with, in our case, a MySQL database. So the full stack mobile, technically, I guess that it would be just the database, like I mentioned, the database, the views, the models, the controllers within the app. But I would say that in most cases, it does have a connectivity to a web server somewhere. So you need to be able to do that as well.
Okay, so it's basically like take web full stack, get rid of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and replace it with mobile.
Yes, and add what you would do, for example, a local database, a client-based database. If you were to do that on JavaScript, that would be kind of like the equivalent on a mobile app.
Okay.
So you have a second database that needs to be, in many cases, kept in sync with the web server.
Okay, that's cool. All right, so we got another question here, which is what would be your methodology for preparing for technical interviews? Oh, that's a great question. Mostly freaking out for about an hour before they happen because I'm always nervous. Uh, um, so I want to know something about the person, not just their name. I want to know at least their resume. I want to know that they have been through some sort of selective process up to this point. Getting through our resume screen takes care of that. But it is also interesting to look at the parts of the resume screen that were pointed out as interesting to make sure that there's enough projects on there to make sure that we're not asking the same sorts of things over and over, or at least not getting the same answers over and over if multiple people ask you the same question. Um, let's see, what else? Uh, I do a lot of setting all of this up right here, getting my timing right, getting my sheets right. We don't always do them in CoderPad. A lot of times we'll do interviews in Google Docs. In Google Docs, you got to really kind of change the font and spread out the margins and get it all right and get your permissions set up right. There's a lot of like just technical get it all set up and you sort of take care of that yourself here. And then beyond that is sort of getting my plan ready, making sure that whatever it is that I need to ask, I'm ready to ask, that I know what direction I want to take the conversation when we're talking about their project, that sort of stuff. Uh, Making sure that whatever question that I chose, I am extremely ready to answer questions in, and that I have seen answered at least 4 or 5 different ways. Before I ask any question in a technical interview, I do a lot of studying. I will answer it myself. I will perform at least 3 different people test interviews to make sure that I have seen people working through it so I can sort of have a feel for like what the pace should be if the person's succeeding or if they're not succeeding. And then also just to make sure that I don't try to guide people down one path to solving the problem, which is the path that I know or the way that I would have done it. They need to do it the way that they were going to do it, and me as the developer or me as the interviewer need to give them the opportunity to answer it in the way that they want to answer it. So the only way to do that is really to either sit there and let them fail, or have an idea about different ways to do it to make sure that you can sort of guide them down whichever path they decide to take. And then outside of that, I actually like do practice answering questions about the company. It's super, I don't want to say embarrassing, but it's awkward being caught off guard on a question. Like not being prepared for a question makes it seem like you don't want to answer the question. At least in the experience that I've had where that's happened. And people do ask me new questions all the time. And it happens, and you just kind of have to roll with it. But after I get asked a question, I write it down and I try to answer it, and I write down a little script to make sure that the next time I come around to answering it, I'm much ready to go. All of the questions that you asked me, I was clearly prepared for.
And for
Um,
those of you who don't know, whenever Nick says that he really studies something, he really means it.
I appreciate that. Um, Also, what would weigh more on a resume, creating a side project or contributing to open source? Side projects, side projects, side projects, live on the internet, live on whatever, like real things in the wild. An open source project that isn't being used is about as valuable as the code that you're going to write in this interview. It's great that you put this code out there in the world, but if nobody's using it, what kind of value does it have? Like, when you have users who are using your thing and you have to deal with the pushback of like making it work to solve their problem, that's your entire job. Like when you go and do work, like you are solving real people's problems who are willing to pay to have those problems solved. And so having experience interacting with teams, having experience interacting with clients, all of these things are far more valuable than an open source project, at least in my opinion. An open source project like jQuery or Pandas or whatever that's like enormous and everybody uses it, well, obviously that's going to be a super valuable thing. But I hope that sort of explains the difference. But that's a good question. I really appreciate that. So until we get more questions, let's go back. We were talking about, yeah, we were talking about something. What were we talking about?
I had a question that was asked from my students, and
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
tried to answer it the best I could. But if you don't mind giving me your take on it, how bad is it, for example, when somebody you ask a question in an interview, and the interviewee, in this case, the role that I was playing, does not know, and I just say, honestly, I do not know, and I'll be glad to go and research that versus just trying to wing it and in most cases failing.
Yeah, that comes up all the time. The short answer is you should try to answer any question. You don't have to get an answer. The only time when I would say I don't know is when there's 30 seconds left in the interview. And at that point, we don't have a lot to do. Thank you. I can't say that. Muraraji. I'm sorry, I just butchered that. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. So yeah, with like 30 seconds left, if somebody asked you like how many hard drives would it take to fill Yankee Stadium, like why can't you answer that, right? You can. It's like, well, how big is a hard drive and how big is the stadium and can we fill them up with a volume? Where's the spaces that they don't fit? Do the chairs, do they have to get all funky around them? And then like how much data would all of these hard drives that filled Yankee Stadium hold? Well, I mean, you should just try to answer these questions, right? Just be methodical about it. It's really all somebody wants to see is just you being methodical about solving a problem. You're not going to get the answer. Like you're just not going to get it right. No matter what you say, it would just be like a complete crapshoot, and it would be no less valuable than missing it by one, right? As long as you had some way of judging it. In fact, God, there was a tweet very recently about what's his name, Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he was like, yeah, there's two people. It's like, how tall is this building? And two people came into the interview, and one person had read the plaque on the way in and knew exactly how tall the building was, right? So he's in the interview, and he just gives the answer. And yay, he got the answer, right? But the second person didn't read the plaque when they came in because of whatever reason. They're in the interview, and now they said, okay, I don't know, but give me just a minute. And he goes outside and he sees a shadow casted on the ground. So he measures the shadow and he measures the length of the shadow and he measures, whatever else. And and says, okay, I can tell you how tall the building is because I created an equation and I solved it from an equation, right? Now, which one of these two people would you hire? The person who knew it or the person who knew how to figure it out? Um,
Of course, the person I knew how to figure it out.
exactly, right? And so that's really all people are looking for when they're asking you questions that you just can't answer. If they're asking you like knowledge questions and you don't know it, okay, well then just don't just say you don't know it. Like if they're like, what is the function in Python for counting unique elements in an array or something like that, and you don't know what it is, you're not gonna reason your way through that one. Just say you don't know. But
Hmm.
if it's to figure something out and there's a methodology that can be used to figure it out, then try to figure it out. Let's see. Another question here. What interviewers write you off for trying to bullshit? Oh, would interviewers write you off for trying to bullshit? Yes. Yeah. There's a very specific way that I'm going to say yes here. The yes is you're trying to tell a story and you're not going deep, right? I'm going to constantly ask you to explain the one thing that you just talked about in more depth. And then we're going to dig deeper on whatever answer you give to me on that. And then we're going to dig deeper on whatever answer you give to me on that until eventually I'm satisfied that you know this thing at a very deep level. If I ask you to go deeper and you change the subject back to something else, well, it's clear that you're telling me a story, something that you had like prepared. And at that point, I can no longer give you credit for knowing something at a deep level because you're not showing me that you know it at a deep level. Always respond to the prompts given to you by your interviewer, no matter what. Just respond to their prompts in any way, shape, or form. Don't just brush them off. Try to give the best answer you can before you start going back to whatever the other thing is, and make sure that the interviewer is okay with the response that you have given before trying to switch back to what you just did. And that's like the best advice that I can give you there. Just trying to snowball and tell a story that you had planned to tell when you came in is like that is just not a great way to go about it. It's not going to win you any points. Okay, great. So that was a really good question from Pablo, though. I really like that one about your students. So that does come up all the time. Is like when to just say I don't know, and the answer is try not to unless it's just obvious that like you can't answer it. And in that case, mm, don't snowball it. Just let them know that you're trying. Like I
Hmm.
have no idea how many hard drives fit in Yankee Stadium, but I know how big they are and I know like how big Yankee Stadium is and blah 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 and just, get as detailed and go into as much depth and make it as crazy as you can. Can be a lot of fun to do that as well.
See, I would ask to rephrase the question using a soccer stadium instead of a baseball stadium. That would make it much easier for
Well, it would
my
depend on
background.
which soccer stadium anyway, because there's got to be ones of different sizes, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
That's funny. Yeah, so we were also telling a story though. I do these interviews about or with Digital Craft, and these boot camp interviews were so much different than like doing interviews for Stack Overflow or for Carrot, in that these people were always coming out and saying like, they were undergoing a really big life change. A lot of the people who end up going to code boot camps are like, I don't like what I'm doing. I'm going to change careers. And so they have left this thing that they are really good at doing and they've been doing for years. And now they're going to go and do something that they've been doing for 16 weeks. They're going to try and get a job doing that professionally in one of the most competitive markets in the world. What is your YouTube channel? Oh, I do have one. I don't actually have any videos on there, but I'll tweet about it. So just follow me on Twitter. Um, anyway, so back to the story here, and like the breakdown rate in those interviews is like incredible. It's got to be like 50% like just complete and utter train wreck. And like of that 50%, probably the 50% of that ends up in just like bawling in tears and not knowing what's going to happen with our life in the next like 6 weeks. But that's like the magic of it is I love doing these sort of mock interviews because you need to have that experience with me. You don't need to have that experience with the company that you want to go work for, you know.
Hmm.
And so that's sort of that's why I really enjoy doing those. But yeah. Anyway, any more questions? We got about 3 more minutes on the stream here. Did you have anything else? What are you working on right now?
Right now, I'm working actually on something that we looked at last semester, voice authentication as a second uh, factor for two-factor authentication.
Oh,
So
interesting.
matching voice profiles and but very nice. I'm reminding of like Chiba Bounce, and it's all coming back crashing into my head.
That was my least favorite assignment. That was just absolutely my, there's no, it's not a real algorithm. It's like,
it's
do it
it's
by
the
hand.
I.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
was
that
fun.
I particularly did not enjoy that question on the final exam.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that one was so hard.
But of course, if the professors of that ever come across this video, I love the class. Um, Looking forward to seeing them in May,
Yeah.
and I have no criticism.
All right, we got one more question here, which is what portion of your job is coding product versus interviewing? So interviewing is very sporadic. We start hiring and we stop hiring. When we are hiring, I will do a lot of interviews, like five, six a week sometimes, and a lot of resume reviews leading up to that. Everybody does resume reviews. The interviewers are smaller. It's mostly like a volunteer thing. It's not like, oh, you got chosen to do interviews. It's just again something that I really enjoy. So I would say that like in a year, which is the way that I would measure this, probably spend about 2 weeks doing interviews full time, and the rest of it would be working on coding and product. Another question here, what is the most common question you ask when interviewing? Well, I ask the same question and everyone tell me about a project that you worked on, so that's the most common one. If you had something more specific or whatever, just let me know and I will get back to that. Thanks for the stream. Again, thank you for joining us. We will do it again. I'm going to try and stream every Friday from about 1 to 3 p.m. The day before on Thursday, check on Twitter and I will post the topics which I hope to ask about. And it's just going to be like a Twitter poll, and whichever one wins, we'll end up doing. So thanks again for Pablo for joining us today. You really did great, and you took it all like a champ. And thanks for the discussion afterward. It's been really great. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It was a blast.
All right, that's it for the stream today, everybody. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.